All right. Wow. Welcome everyone. Wow, I'm so excited. This is going to be a hot topic, it looks like. So welcome to today's webinar, Board Budgets and Beyond. I'm so thrilled to have you all join us as we dive into another hot topic. My name is Millie Ventura. I'm the Business Development Manager for the Palm Beach region at Castle, and I'll be your host for this webinar today alongside my partners, Aileen Zorilla, who is the Broward BD, and Jessica Raffle, who is the Miami BD. Joining us today is Brian Street, EVP of Operations for Castle, Nicole Johnson from Hafer, and Nick Brenneman from Reserve Advisors. Before we kick off the discussion, I invite you all to actively engage by asking questions in the chat. Displayed on the screen is information on how to submit a question. Aileen, Jess, and I are going to be assisting behind the scenes, reviewing the chat and making sure that we don't miss your questions. I now have the panel to introduce themselves. Brian, would you like to go first?
Yes, thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Got a big group of attendees. So I'm Brian Street. I'm Castle Group's Executive Vice President over Operations. Been with Castle for a little over 12 years. Actually came from the engineering background first, and then worked my way into the property management world. And it's been joy working for Castle and working with our great partners that we have here. And I took a passion with the budget season and been one of my fortes ever since. So looking forward to helping you through this process. Has to be done every year, so there's always something new to learn. So I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel honored today to be a part of this group with Castle and Nick Brennan from Reserve Advisories. Today's going to be a great class. I think most of you are really wanting to understand what's coming. We're a full service CPA firm that concentrates in the area of HOAs, condominiums, developer turnovers, really concentrating in the area of finances, budgeting, audits, reviews, compilations, and taxes. And this year is very important for everybody to understand the budgeting process. So I think you're going to get a lot of information out of today, and I appreciate everybody attending. Turn over to Nick.
Thank you. Excited to be here as well. Definitely an honor to be part of this panel. And I'm with Reserve Advisors. I've been with them for 14 years doing reserve studies. That's our core focus. And we're just excited to kind of help you guys understand the next steps. We started a couple years ago when they passed these condo safety laws, and the message was, what is the requirement, what is the CSRS? And now today we're hopefully going to take that a step further. Now that you have the report or are getting closer to having your report in your hands, how do you implement that, and what does that look like? So it's just excited to be along with this group today, and hopefully you guys have some good takeaways that you can take back to your associations, and we can be a resource for you. So thank you for having me.
We appreciate you guys being here. So Brian, take it over.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So first off, obviously we are in budget season for most associations, obviously that are on a calendar year, where that would end in 12/31 of 2024. And as Nick, you mentioned, there's a lot of legislation that has been in the news the last couple of years. And so how that changes the overall process. And the reason why we wanted to do this webinar is, it's August and you think, oh, I have a long time until the end of the year and we have to get these coupons or statements out, but it goes by fast. I mean, it's August now and next week is September. And then you're down to the holiday season, and, your residents may be either flocking in from other parts of the country to, want to make sure that you're enjoying the holidays. So we at Castle like to start this process very early. So in May, June, we start looking at the financials and start pulling in all the data, because most of it, and Nick, Nicole, I'm sure you can agree, most of your contracts, or most of your budget is probably 80% are contractual items. So they don't really change. You have your, maybe it increases, maybe it's a 2, 3, 4% increase in your contracts right there. So you already know what is going to be part of that budget. That takes care of 80% of it. And then you should just have, another, say, 20%. I'm using rough numbers here, but another 20% that is kind of discretionary funds, things that, may fluctuate throughout the year. electricity, water, sewer, maybe some office operational expenses. So, I mean, that's the big part. And so what you should do is partner up with your teammates, your CPA, your reserve company, your other vendors, and understand what this is going to happen, and start building your budget, start working on those drafts, start getting those things together, because you understand what it's going to do. And we've all suffered through, last year, I think, was probably the insurance year, of where all of the insurances increased, and we all had to figure out how the budgets were going to account for that and what that was going to do to our dues. So this year, I think, is, and I kind of want to toss the first question out, is to Nick here, is, when the SB4D and SB 154 came out and we required the SERS requirements, it's now due. And so now we're kind of running up against some deadlines. And we wanted to kind of have this as one of the main topics of today, is the SERS, or Structural Integrity Reserve Study, that will be needed. And some of you on here may be part of an HOA, but there's still a lot of ties to what are in the reserves, and being able to bifurcate them into the two, and what does fully funded mean. And so really want to get into, how those things are going to impact your budget, and then have Nicole kind of chime in from, the CPA side, reviewing how you're setting up your budgets and what that's going to be. So Nick, maybe talk a little bit about, what is a SERS, Structural Integrity Reserve Study? How is it different than the normal reserves?
Yeah, definitely. The Structural Integrity Reserve Study was basically the legislature's attempt at isolating some reserves and making them unwaivable. So when we had the condo collapse, they basically wanted to prevent that from ever happening again. And part of that was making sure associations weren't kicking the can down the road when it came to their major capital projects, repair and replacements that were vital to the safety of the building. And rather than make all reserves unwaivable, what they did was they delineated certain structural components to become unwaivable. And they call those the structural integrity reserve components. And so that would be your roof, your structure, your fireproofing and your fire protection systems, plumbing, electrical systems, waterproofing and exterior painting, and then windows and exterior doors. There's also a letter H, which is kind of a caveat that says any other component over $10,000 that would negatively impact any of those other structural components. So that's your group of structural components that now they have to be reserved for separately, and their funding is now unwaivable, regardless of the member vote. And when exactly that goes into place, we'll talk about the specifics of that. But essentially that was the intent, was to isolate out those structural components and make sure that associations weren't kicking the can down the road, so that they would remain, they would have the cash needed on hand for those repair and replacement projects that are integral to the building safety. And the Structural Integrity Reserve Study was the way of which we were going to accomplish that, which was essentially a reserve study, which has been around for a long time. We've been doing them for over 30 years. It's always been a best practice, which it's an inspection, it's an evidence-based look at the capital projects that are coming up, future costs and the timing associated with those events, and then a recommended funding plan to offset those expenses, making sure that the money is there at strategic times when you need those funds available. So the Structural Integrity Reserve Study was a reserve study on those structural components. And that was basically what 4D said, what the requirement was. And so now when you're working on your budget, you have to, let me back up. So the Structural Integrity Reserve Study must be completed by the end of this year. So you've had a couple of years to do it since they passed 4D, but now that deadline is coming up quick, 12/31 of 2024, and they're not extending that, they're not pushing that out. That is the deadline to have the Structural Reserve Study done. And like you were saying, Brian, the sooner the better. I mean, I would say for a large portion of providers, some of the biggest ones in the state, that ship has sailed and they're at capacity to get you a report by 12/31. And so your best bet is to get it done as soon as you can, because what they say is that the statute says that if you fail to get the Structural Reserve Study done, it's a breach of the fiduciary duty. It does specify that they say if the board willfully and knowingly fails to get the Structural Reserve Study done, then they're breaching their fiduciary duty. And so I say that for the folks that haven't gotten it done yet, that are kind of panicking. Oh no, now we're going to be non-compliant. The DBPR is going to knock on our door and fine us and cite us. My advice to you is don't willfully and knowingly avoid this, but reach out to firms, get proposals, get under a contract, and get it done as soon as you can, as close to the deadline as possible. So, this isn't really going anywhere. And then once you have your structural reserve study done, that's going to tell you how much you need to reserve for those structural components. And then you also need to keep that fund separate from the rest of your reserve study components, which are anything I didn't list in the structural components, you would still be reserving for, because the condos are governed by 718, which requires full funding of reserve for roofs, painting, paving, and any other expense over $10,000. That hasn't gone anywhere. So if you're looking at your swimming pool or your elevators, there's things that aren't structural components that are easily over $10,000 that you'd want to reserve for. So now life after SERS in reserve world, in budget world, is 2 separate reserve accounts. One for your structural reserves and one for your non-structural or your general reserves. With the structural being unwaivable in the very near future. And I'll put an asterisk there. We'll come back to that, I'm sure. And the non-structural, you can still continue to waive with a majority vote of total membership. So even if you're 3 stories or higher and you're required to get the SERS, those non-structural components, anything not called out in the statute as a structural component, the membership can vote to waive or partially fund that, as they always have in the past. So that's this idea that the government didn't want to just make all reserves unwaivable, because they don't care if you're reserving for something that's more discretionary. The intent was really to keep the building safe and really, isolate those structural reserves they're integral to keeping the people safe that are living there. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the structural reserve study.
Nick, one of the comments you made earlier about, if somebody hasn't contracted with somebody, what we're telling our clients is, because we're seeing many of them that haven't, and you guys are on backlog right now, we're telling them to reach out to their attorneys. That if you haven't signed or what's going on, reach out with your legal team to find out what you need to do to make sure that you are in compliance. What are you saying? Are you guys saying the same thing?
Yeah, it's always good to get your attorney's advice. I would say, generally speaking, what we're hearing from, major insurers who provide directors and officers policies, what we're hearing from DBPR and just kind of, through the grapevine, is that there's going to be more leniency on associations that haven't willfully ignored this. We've always known since 2022 that there's not enough engineers compared to the amount of condos that need to get these SERS done. It was an impossibility to do that. So we knew there was going to be a portion of associations that met the requirement but weren't able to get it done in time simply due to capacity. And we're getting to that point now. And so I don't think anyone's really shocked. But what they're going to do is, it's the associations who haven't pursued proposals, even to this day, who aren't under a contract, where there's really going to be no excuse, and that would be a clear breach of the fiduciary duty. So even though you missed the deadline, the sooner that you can get it done, the better. And, the other thing is enforcement comes up a lot. There's what's going to happen after 12/31 if I don't have my SERS. And in reality, the DBPR is tasked with enforcing that, but they don't have the manpower to go cite every single association that doesn't have a SERS on January 1st. So what it's really going to look like is, if someone files a complaint or there's an issue, trying to get insurance or trying to buy or sell a unit, because that association, according to the law, if you're 3 stories or higher residential condo, you're obligated to have a SERS completed in your hands. So if there's a business transaction happening at the association, that could easily be a stipulation. We need to see your SERS. And if you say, uh-oh, we don't have a SERS, then they're going to look into that. And then if there's a complaint filed and it's clear that the board completely ignored it willfully and knowingly, then there could be a breach of their fiduciary duty. So the best thing you can do is put it in the minutes, get proposals, get under a contract. You're not alone in this situation, but you want to protect yourself so that, if anyone looks into it, it's very clear that you were pursuing this and it was just a capacity supply and demand issue that prevented you from getting it done in time. And I'm hearing that from a lot of the attorneys too, that they're advising their clients the same thing, just be under a contract by the end of the year at minimum.
Yeah, that's we're making that big push as well, Nick, is kind of what we were talking about earlier. A lot of boards also think that there could be some changes to the law. And I like how you put out there, guys. There right now in 4 months, there are no changes. The CSRS is due. Unfortunately, our legal system, we've thrown out glitch bills and everything else, and they think there may be a delay. But as it stands right now, it is due. And we've been, really hounding our boards as well to make sure go get it. If you're making the right business decision to engage, if they can't get the work done until middle of 2025, okay, but that's just you can justify that decision. You've made the right decision from a business standpoint.
Yes.
One of the questions, I don't want to surround it all by CSRS. I know that's a big topic, but maybe go into basic kind of what the reserve means. So a lot of our HOA boards, maybe they have a reserve study and they've received it, and it says the roof is, has an 8 to 10 year lifespan left. What is, is it just conservatism? Like you're just trying to be conservative? We don't quite know. What should they plan for? Does that give them the discretion to pick 8 years and we're going to do the roof, or 10 years? And because obviously that would impact, maybe some of the, if they're doing straight line, obviously, maybe talk through what those different pooled versus straight line and kind of a little history about the reserves.
Sure. So reserves are basically funds that are set aside for capital projects ahead of time. And the idea here is that if we don't fund for these major projects in advance and plan ahead, then we're going to have a shortfall and we're going to need to special assess, or we're going to have to take, try to take out a loan. There's going to be some sort of a financial deficit there. So reserves are really how this whole thing has been designed to work. It's that everybody is paying their fair share on an ongoing basis for these capital projects, so that when the time comes to repair or replace, the money is there. And I say that the fair share because it's the most equitable way of funding capital projects. You think of a special assessment, whoever is living there at that point in time is paying the full bill for that component's use, whether the person just moved out or just moved in. Reserves, it's a gradual contribution. Generally, it's pretty stable. We look over time, so there's an inflationary increase. But generally speaking, the contribution is going to be relatively predictable, because what we've done is we've looked at all of the projects that are coming up, and then we've strategically put together a balance between the cash in and the cash out, with inflows to your reserves in the form of reserve contributions. As far as the pooled versus the straight line reserves is also known as component reserves, and that's when each reserve account is designated or dedicated to one individual component. And this is kind of an old school legacy way of doing things, and more we're finding that it's kind of gone out of style, so to speak, because a lot of associations thought that it provided more protection, but it ultimately is really going to tie up your funds and give you higher funding requirements than if you would switch to more of a strategic pooled method. Pooled, another word for that, synonymous, is the cash flow. So in a pooled plan, we're looking at all of your assets at once. And like I described, we're balancing the cash in and the cash out of the entire pool of assets. When someone says cash flow funding or pooled funding, that's because we're doing a cash flow analysis on the entire pool of assets and coming up with a strategic funding plan to keep your reserves at an adequate level. If we say component or straight line, that's really earned that title because it's a straight line depreciation calculation, where we take the unfunded balance divided by the remaining life to get our contribution each year for that component, and then we add them all up at the very end. So because we're calculating each of them individually and then only at the end summing them together, it's generally not as strategic as you can be when you're looking at the pool and doing a cash flow, which results in higher contributions to your reserves when you do the component funding. So the other thing about the component method is that those funds are restricted, their use, to that individual component. So this is one very important thing about reserves, about structural reserves, all reserves, is that reserves must be used for their intended designated purpose. And if there are funds that have been restricted or accounts that are restricted, the only way to unrestrict those funds is with a membership vote. So if you have component reserves and you have a roof reserve account, you can't use that money that's been previously restricted to roofs on any other component other than roofs unless you get a membership vote to unrestrict those funds. Pooled is not the Wild West because you still can only use your reserves for the intended purpose. It's just that when you have pooled reserves, the intended purpose now is any component that's listed in the pooled list of components. So and that's something that we can use this idea of the intended purpose even into the structural reserves, because a lot of folks now are saying, all right, we used to have one reserve or component accounts for our reserves, but we never had to segregate out our structural from our non-structural. So now we're kind of in uncharted territory. How do we make those decisions of what goes where and how, what's acceptable there? And a lot of it, well, it's probably important to get a legal, opinion, because the statute does not make it explicitly clear on how this is done. You can go back to that idea of the intended purpose. If you have component accounts right now and you have a roof reserve, then when you do your structural reserve study, I would see no problem using that roof reserve money into your structural integrity money, because the roof, it's still being used for the designated purpose, which was the roof. Same thing, if you have pooled, you can, you're probably pretty safe to continue to pool your reserves because you've already pooled those reserves. So it's kind of, if as long as it's being used for that designated purpose, then that's pretty much, the litmus test if it's appropriate to use those reserves. So someone will say, Nick, can I use reserves for this? That's where I always start, is what is the intended purpose? When that money was collected, what was the intended purpose? Whether you're pooled or a component, and then we kind of work from there. So that's kind of one of the biggest challenges right now, is now associations need to take what they had in reserve, one reserve, and allocate it between structural and non-structural. And to figure out how that works, is, we're kind of, that's where the rubber meets the road with this whole SERS thing.
Well, so, and I saw a bunch of questions come through. So just for clarity, the pooled method is allowed for the structural reserve?
It is, but not to be confused with pooling structural and non-structural together. You have to have two separate pools, but the DBPR has clarified that pooling is still permissible.
Actually, I know there was some confusion back and forth when the law was just coming out and what was going to be allowed and not allowed. And I want to dig into that a little bit more, and maybe Nicole and both of you, if you already have a set of pooled funds, how do you allocate what was, and we'll use our roof example again, roof now moves over into structural, but it's been a pool. So how do you take, you have $100,000 in your pooled fund. How do you take what portion of that gets moved out for roof into the structural piece?
That's really the $1 million question. And, different firms, I think, are taking different approaches. But generally speaking, we look at the pool. Your pooled reserve now is going to include structural and non-structural components. And so what we need to do is kind of parse those out. And then we have to determine the proper allocation of your reserve funds between structural and non-structural. And you could look at, okay, do we put 100% of our money into structural and 0 in non-structural, or vice versa? What we want to do is find that sweet spot. And what we've developed is, an optimizer. So basically we run 100 different scenarios of different amounts in structural versus non-structural. And what we're looking to identify is the lowest possible reserve contribution, to make sure that both of those are going to be adequately funded, but we're not going to be overfunding our reserves, and that we have our lowest contribution. And so we run this optimizer and say, okay, in this specific example, where the association has these expenses coming up in X number of years, and this is their current reserve balance, it's 80% structural, 20% non-structural. It's going to be different for every association. Even different firms are taking different approaches, but that's how we're doing it. Is we're kind of running that optimizer and saying, okay, how can we satisfy the needs of both while exploring the minimum level of funding that's to be adequately funded.
Are you seeing a lot of associations where they're moving most of their non-Sears over to the Sears, so that's going to be fully funded, and then they're leaving 0 in the non-Sears? Are you seeing a lot of them move the money over, allocate it?
I think I'm seeing more of that because they want to make sure that that's funded, and then they have less flexibility on that end too. So
Right.
I think they're doing that strategically. What about you, Nicole? Are you seeing the same?
Yeah, so most of our associations that I'm meeting with budgets, their main focus is keeping maintenance fees down, as we all know. So they're like, the more we move over to Sears, then we're gonna waive the non-Sears, and if that comes due, we'll special assess for that, because they want to make sure that their fees are not so astronomical that people can't afford to live there, even though those items down the road are still going to have to be funded somehow, but they would rather do it through a special assessment rather than funding it fully. So yes, I'm seeing a majority of doing that.
Right, which really highlights the point that your SERS reserve funding is unwaivable. Regardless of the member vote, you have to fund according to your SERS, those structural integrity reserves. And
Mhm.
so they do have that flexibility with the non-structural still to get the member vote, but they don't with the SERS. And so as far as how do we work that into our budget, I think that's a great, kind of segue, because this is an important topic. And that is, when do we need to start funding our reserves according to the SERS? And there's a lot of different responses and a lot of different information out there, because what the statute says, and I want to pull up the exact wording just so we're all on the same page here. For budgets adopted on or after December 31st of 2024, the unit owner controlled association that must obtain a SERS may not determine to provide no reserves or less reserves required for their structural reserves. So they're basically saying any budget approved after 2024, you cannot waive the funding of those SERS reserves. So there's going to be a lot of budgets that have started already right now that will be approved this calendar year. And according to the statute, the association has the ability to get a membership vote to waive the funding of their SERS reserves for their 2025 budget. So that's that extra year, that bonus year people have been kind of, conversationally talking about. It's not that you just don't have to fund your SERS next year. It's that if you get a membership vote to waive the reserves, the SERS reserves are still waivable for your 2025, but you have to, you're going to lose the right to do that when you're working on your budget in 25 for 2026.
Right.
So if you don't have your SERS yet, and you're freaking out because how can we fund our SERS in 2025 if we don't have our SERS yet? I'm here to tell you that you can get the membership vote to waive the funding of the SERS reserves in 2025. So that's going to give you some time to prepare. If you have your SERS, the writing's on the wall, and there's increases that are coming. And so it probably would not be in good business judgment to completely ignore those funding increases or funding recommendations, even though you have the ability to waive, because all you're really doing is delaying the inevitable, and you're just going to have more of an increase when that requirement does hit in your 2026 budget. So it's good to kind of start ramping up into that, getting the owners, communicating what's going on, getting them used to that, that higher level of assessment. And really, we're saying higher, but it's really just kind of reality. It's where things should have been all the time. It's just that they've been artificially suppressed by not taking an honest look at what it costs to live in those communities with those types of assets.
And I think owners too that are moving down here or buying into these communities are more educated in the sense they're looking at the audit report that's saying, okay, they waived this, but this is what they're responsible for. So regardless if you're not funding it, an owner's still going to know that this is going to come in a special assessment form, or it's going to be a part of the maintenance fee. So even though you're keeping them low, there's still going to be out there those non-Sears that are going to have to be funded. So people are getting more educated because it is in the audit report. All of this is fully disclosed to people that regardless if they're not funding it, this is what is potential down the road for that expense.
And we've had, a lot of older communities, and, I'm sure we've all heard the same phrase, I'll be dead before, this happens. And so, the board, artificially kept the assessments low and not really saved for the right path. And I think that's where, I think Nick used the phrase, the rubber's really hitting the road this year. And, hopefully they're getting their SERS. But they're also, even if they're moving into a big, large HOA, I don't want to kind of only focus on the condos, because even moving into a large HOA that has a huge amenity center, if you have a big clubhouse, they should be saving for the roadways. They should be saving for the clubhouse. They should be saving for everything that's in the community as well, because again, a large HOA could have $3, $4, $5 million worth of pavement restoration, coming due in the next, couple of years. So if you're not saving, that's a massive special assessment. And with the way that inflation has been going, I know we were talking about this earlier. with the way that inflation has happened, the supply demand curves has really caused prices to skyrocket. And so I want to kind of go on to, if I know we're doing the SIRS, but when and how often should we get an updated reserve study? Because I'm looking at a few questions here, and we had one, they're using it, they're not using it, could be a couple years old, because inflation is a big number. If you had a pavement cost, say 5 years ago to 4 years ago, 2020, that inflation has really skyrocketed. If you get a new reserve study now, when should we start getting new reserve studies?
It's always been a best practice, at least several years ago and years before that, with every 3 to 5 years to get your reserve study updated. Recently, with what we've seen, it just makes business sense to get it done more frequently than that. So 3 years is probably the minimum I would go, and that's to do another site visit reserve study. And that's where we're going to really be reassessing the condition of the components, redetermining the remaining useful lives based on how things are aging. But even, before 3 years is up, this is something you want to look at on an annual basis at a minimum. You can do a financial update without a site visit, desktop update, or what the National Reserve Study Standards call a level 3 reserve study update without a site visit. The other thing is a lot of providers now have great tools that you can utilize to have a living document of your reserve study. So as that have an inflationary factor built in, that as costs are changing, as projects are being undertaken, you can keep track of those and really just kind of make sure that you're still on track and bring in the reserve professional to, sign off on it or bring all the costs up to date when you need them. But it's kind of becoming a thing where, you have to look at it on a pretty frequent basis to keep it up to date. It's not set it and forget it. We have to remember this is it's a snapshot in time, and it's evidence-based, but it's built on what we saw at that time, not just what we saw on site, but what we're seeing in the economy, what we're seeing on the cost side of things, labor, materials, what we're seeing as far as the condition goes. How have these components been aging? How long do we think they're going to live? All of that is going to change over time and eventually deviate, from reality. No matter how good we are at estimating, we don't have a crystal ball. So we want to keep that, updated. And I think a living document is the best way to do that. And, then the board is really empowered to keep track of things. And also remember that there's other levels of service other than a full reserve study that are available to them that are going to be more cost effective, like, a reserve study update without a site visit. So those are good options. As far as it's interesting, as far as frequency goes for the SIRS, the statute says that it's a 10-year reporting cycle. So they're saying that you don't need to update your SIRS report for 10 years. And that kind of goes against what we've been doing for the last 30 plus years, which is every 3, maybe 5 years max. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. I think that just, reality is gonna cause associations to want and need to update sooner than every 10 years. Because it says you have to follow the funding of the most recent SIRS. You're obligated to fund now according to an 8, 9, 10-year-old document. I don't think that's really setting the association up for long-term financial success. So
I don't either. And what I'm seeing too from the audit side is most of my associations that aren't in the component method, they're in the pulling method. I would probably say 90% of our associations, self-managed wise, their pulling schedules are wrong. So they're not doing them correctly. They don't know how to do them. They're not putting in the numbers correctly. So it's a problem. It's in our audit reports that you need to make sure that you're hiring a reserve company to do these schedules. If you're updating them, it's fine, but they're required to be updated annually. And most of them are not correct.
that's a great point, Nicole. Because we have to remember, like, the reserve study is a 30-year forecast, and it's built on the previous years. So if I'm saying what's going to happen next year, we've got a certain starting balance, we've got a certain contribution, we've got certain expenses, and all of that math is how we calculate the next year. And so it just builds on top of each other. So the minute one of those things gets out of whack, then the whole system is inaccurate and we need to recalibrate it. Whether that's you're not contributing what the reserve study said you should be contributing, whether the projects aren't happening at the same cost or the same timing, all of those factors can make it deviate from reality. and then you want to kind of recalibrate, I think is a good word. This is something that we want to constantly be course correcting, making sure
We
we're
had
still
an
on track.
association that they did their polling schedule themselves. It was incorrect. We brought it up to them in the audit. Someone turned them in from the state. The state came in and said, you didn't get the membership to waive the fully funding because the actual polling schedule was wrong. So they were in violation because they didn't get the vote because the schedule was incorrect. It wasn't fully funding. So
Wow.
that's another problem. They
Yeah,
got fined for it too.
Wow.
yeah.
So let's, so you brought up a couple of different things, Nicole, there, and I think, and looking through a couple of the questions on the side, obviously they're very, very specific on, their individual association. But so just for clarity, and I'll use the SIRS one first. So the association gets their SIRS in 2024. They get their report. They have their reserve schedule, SIRS schedule. They add it to their budget. They are allowed to get that waived, the SIRS and reserves, basically, if they want to keep their assessments low for this is their last year that they can do that. They would need to take 2 votes, or could it be 1 vote that, and that may be their legal question, but they are able to waive it this year.
I'm seeing most of my associations doing it in 1, but the way the attorney draws it up. So their attorney's drawing it up how the language goes, but they do it a 1 time because it's hard to get the vote as is. So
Yeah, exactly right. And then if they don't have enough to waive it, then obviously they have to include the full SIRS in this budget.
yes.
Yeah, that's
So what many associations done in my area, they're having town halls for the last year, explaining the importance of the vote if they're going to do that. And saying, if we don't get this, this is what our maintenance fees will be if we don't get it. But then they're educating too on, if we waive it this year, this is what next year's fees will be. So people also know it's not just gone, it's a 1-time waiver, and next year you're going to be fully funding it.
Transparency is key. It's always been, but now so it's even more important than ever because this is just, it can't be ignored anymore. I mean, and
It's
it
not
can't
going
be,
away.
it's not going away, and people are like more and more aware of it too. So buying and selling units, the assessments are low. What do the reserves look like? What
Right.
projects are coming up and what kind of money is there for those? It's just, the other thing is with the SIRS required funding is it's kind of evening the playing field, because it used to be a tactic to keep
Right.
the dues low, to keep your community looking attractive for potential buyers. No longer is that the case. So while your assessments are going to be increasing, so are your neighbors. I mean, this is going to kind of even the playing field. So that tactic is no longer going to be an option.
I agree.
Now-
It's finally where they're all in the same boat.
Absolutely. And Nick, when you guys are being hired, I know by an HOA it's just a reserve study. When you are hired from a condo that satisfies the 718 requirements for SIRS, are you doing 2 separate reports, or is it just one? These are your SIRS requirements and these are your other reserve requirements that they may have been pooling in the past?
Great question. We're doing one cover with 2 separate financial analyses. So you're going to have a set of expenditures and the related funding for your structural, and a set of expenditures related funding for the non-structural. It's important that the statute doesn't require us to look at the non-structural, but that's really the only way that, like we talked about, one of the biggest challenges is the allocation of your reserve funds between the structural and the non-structural. And so it's really going to be vital that associations have a full picture of all of their reserves. So we won't do a structural reserve study unless we include all reserve components, structural and non-structural. Otherwise, it's you've got so many missing pieces there that it's hard for us to give you, advice if you don't have that full picture. So, but it's one report with the financial, the financials kept separate.
That's great. And then, obviously, we're talking about if they are truly funding and they're not waiving any reserves, there could be a large financial impact to their overall budget. And that's really where the start of this presentation came from. Is there anything that, because it's not part of your operating budget, and Nicole, this is probably more from the CPA side, is there anything that limits how much their dues could increase based on a SIRS report comes back and it's several $100s more? Is there anything that blocks? I know insurance did one, you could isolate insurance out from the operating side.
That's a great question. So what some of our associations have done, and we're talking about the ones that have been financially secure, they have a lot of this equity in their operating side. So some of them have this over 2 to 3 months worth of equity. So I have an association that has about 8 months worth of equity. So they said, we don't really want to impact the association so hard by funding these years. They're pulling from their equity. to fund some of that. They're moving a surplus over and putting it into the reserve side. That's fine if you are financially secure. If some of these associations are working month to month, it's not an option. So another option too, some associations do these door fees. They get these upfront fees. They're getting a couple $100,000 from their Comcast. They're saying, instead of putting it in our operating, we're going to fund that and put it into reserves, which is fine from a tax standpoint, accounting standpoint. And then they're really looking at that operating side and saying, are there areas that maybe we really don't need to be doing, and putting more into the reserve? So there's really a balancing act this budget season of where our operating costs need to be versus really funding these reserves and non-Sears.
Yeah, we're seeing the same from the property management side. What services do we may need to lessen, figure out what that is, and then to make sure that we are funding properly, and because there's a large impact. And this is what we said, one of the questions that came in: when do we start this process? Nick, how long does it take on a normal size and HOA or condo to do the reserve study? Like if somebody called you tomorrow, how long would it typically take?
We're far from typical right now.
Right, that's true,
Seen it like this. So we're at capacity. So we'd probably get started like early Q1 right now. But generally it's been kind of 2 to 3 months to get a reserve study done historically, which I think was why it's so important now to plan ahead. Like you were saying, get those proposals, get under a contract, because just all the providers we're maxed out. I mean, the demand is definitely unprecedented.
Yeah.
So right now we could get started in January, get you a report, early Q1.
Yeah, and to do a good job to walk the community, and from a reserve for a condo, you're roof to garage, and from an HOA, it's all through the neighborhoods, and you're walking the streets and really taking that all in. And this is why we say, from our standpoint, from the management side, we like to start in that kind of May, June. You start laying out a template budget, looking at your contracts, what's coming due, what's going on, start this process for the reserves, if it's an update. And then, we like to take kind of the year-to-date through June financials. So you have 6 months, that's a pretty good kind of number. And again, 80% of your budget is probably contractual. So you could probably extrapolate out the balance of the year fairly easy. And then you have your discretionary throughout. So we kind of like to start in this July period. We know that a lot of our associations, Nicole, I know you go to a lot of the finance committee meetings and everything else throughout this process. I always like to look back at the final budget versus the first kind of draft budget we put together. And you're talking pennies that kind of get tweaked around. They find, $50 here and $500 here. And that's, I think, the other big kind of tip is focus on the real material items. That's what's materially going to change your bottom line. If you change office expense from $5,000 to $4,900, there's you're talking pennies. It's a rounding error. Yeah. So we try to give that advice. We know that there's a lot of very active, and we thank all of our board members for being so active. They're looking out for the best interests of the community. So we want to make sure that we're in this together. I would say, and then start calling your partners, call your landscape vendor, your security company, all those different people, especially when it comes down to the negotiation tactics of, if they have a preset increase, start that process now. And Nicole, I think any other tips that you would give from?
Yeah, so that's a great point. But another side to that is, don't always look for the cheapest. I get too many people that will say, we're going to cut costs in this area. They go to that company and it's a disaster. So they're going back to the original company that they did that for. And then also shopping prices. So I know Nick sees this. They'll say, we got a Sears report done. We don't like it. We don't agree with it. So they're going to go out and try to get a second opinion. That's not the answer. Go back to the reserve company you did it with and talk to them through it. Say maybe there was a miscommunication, or maybe the roof was just done recently and nobody was made aware of it. Things like that. Stay with the company you're with. You don't go out and price shop. Like, yes, maybe if you're getting your landscaping, you're saying we're going to cut this and we think we can get a better bid. But too many people are thinking we're going to get cheaper prices and get the same quality. That doesn't happen. And especially from your management side, who is controlling your entire company, your reserve companies, your attorneys, they're the people that you need to spend the cost on, because they are really keeping that association where it needs to be. Maybe you want to do less tree trimming or something like that. but not in areas that are really crucial to the association. The aesthetics of the association is important as much as the financial stability of the community.
Totally agree. I mean, we see it a lot. We need to shop, and it's almost like like 10 years ago, you would shop for a different insurance broker. You didn't like the pricing, you would shop.
Right.
Those days are gone. With
Gone.
all the insurance companies that have left, you really that this is it. So, shopping for the best price it's the best service. The service that
Right.
is commensurate with what you want for your association is probably the best way to look at it.
I agree.
You're gonna have some that come in high, some that come in low, and somewhere probably in the middle is the right way to do it.
And with
So
mandatory SERS funding, you want to make darn sure that you're confident in whoever's doing your structural reserve study, because whatever they say goes.
mhm.
And
Correct.
so make sure you've got a partner that you really can trust and that knows what they're talking about and can give you the right information.
Yeah, and we're coming down to about, say 10 or so minutes. I want to get through a couple of the questions. And a lot of them were, there's still some disclarity around, the who is responsible from the SERS standpoint. I know we know it's 718 condos, anything above 3 stories. Is there anything that, and I've also heard the 2-story townhouse above a garage, like there's a couple little examples here, when are they included or not? And our kind of rule of thumb is it's above 3 stories, a livable space, and then always check with your attorney. That's gonna look at your documents, look at the statute, to make sure, because it's funny, everybody has a little nuance. Well, our condo association should be, but we have 2-story condos and 4-story condos. So does that average out to 3? So there's always those little tricks. Any ideas? And I just say, check with the attorney.
Yeah, or like a city building official or something. I mean, it's going to be case by case, and I've seen kind of the same scenario in 2 different areas, and when one needed the SERS and one didn't, so it's impossible to kind of make a blanket rule. But if I would say check with the attorney, or just take the better safe than sorry. If it looks like you might need a SERS, but maybe you don't, probably better off to get it just in case it's ever called into question. Take more of a conservative approach.
And then I did have a couple questions come in, Nick, just real quick. I think just some clarity around fully funded. I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, with pooling and fully funded, and how does that, because I think it was easier to say fully funded from a component standpoint, because you were easily to isolate versus the pooled. If you can maybe go through that again.
Yes, let's do it. That's such an important topic. Like I was just saying, what the structural reserve study says you have to fund is what you have to fund. So it's really important we know a thing or two about reserve funding, what full funding means, and what the statute is actually saying and what it's not saying. There's, the bare minimum that you can fund is what we call baseline funding. And that is over the scope of the study, the span of the study. So say it's a 30-year reserve study plan, that you never fall below $0 in your reserve account over the 30 years, that all of your expenses have been identified, and that you're going to be adequately prepared without being at risk of special assessments. As long as you remain cash positive in all 30 years at the end of each year, then you are baseline funding your reserves, and that is, acceptable according to the statutes. Because what the SERS requires is that you have a fully funded reserve budget, not a fully funded reserve balance. And that's an important distinction, because the fully funded balance is all of the money to replace that component right now. And a fully funded budget is we are on a path that we will have the money when we need it, and that everything's been identified and planned. So in the component method, we calculate that with a straight line depreciation calculation. In the pooled method, we look at the kind of the baseline over the 30 years, where does our reserve balance end up each year, and making sure we stay above 0. Now, that's called baseline funding. That's the bare minimum. What we always recommend is to be a bit more conservative than that. It's called the threshold funding. And threshold is the same idea, where we want to keep our reserves above a certain threshold over the 30 years, but that threshold is higher than 0. It's some number or some percentage of your capital projects, just a little margin of error, so that you can have a little bit more peace of mind. You don't want to cut it too close. And so that's threshold funding. And then there's also, full funding. You're going to see a lot of this out there, and it's important that you understand what it means. Percent funded is a measurement of reserve fund strength at any one point in time. And so you might get a reserve study. It's okay. How's the best way to describe this? Different reserve funding plans have different objectives. And it's important you understand what the funding objective is of that plan. And one objective is baseline funding. So we put this plan together and it's to keep your reserves above zero over the next 30 years. One objective is threshold funding. We have a plan over 30 years, we keep your reserves above some sort of a threshold where we're going to really draw those reserves down to their lowest point, and we have big projects. Another objective is called percent funded, where we're putting a plan together that's going to give you a 100% funded reserve balance at some point in the future, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years. Generally speaking, if your objective is to achieve a certain percent funded, what you're really doing is just building up your reserves to get to 100% funded in 20 years or 30 years. And then in 30 years, you have millions of dollars in your reserves. You can say, hey, look, we're 100% funded, pat yourselves on the back, but you have all this money in 20 years and it's ignoring the context of the expenses. And so you've got money there that could potentially be misused. It's hard for a board to justify why we need all that money at the end of the 20 or 30 years. So the moral of the story is the thing with the percent funded is if we're trying to achieve a percent funded 100%, we're going to just be putting more and more and more money into our reserves and building up our reserves. So we're going to be overfunding generally, and we're going to have higher contributions than may be necessary. So 100% funded is going to be your highest contribution. And the objective is let's achieve this 100% funded balance number. Generally speaking, not what the statute requires and really going to be a higher contribution. Then a step down from that would be threshold funding, where let's just keep our reserves above a certain threshold. That's kind of that sweet spot, that Goldilocks, I would say. Baseline funding is your bare minimum. Look, if you're strapped for cash and you're just trying to comply, baseline funding, you're still going to be compliant, but I would say you don't really have that margin of error in those critical years where you have a really low reserve balance that's getting close to zero. So the one takeaway to leave with is that full funding just means that you have the money there when you need it, based on one of the acceptable reserve calculations, one of which is component, another of which is pooled or cash flow funding. So percent full funded, balance, percent funded, threshold funding, baseline funding, just different funding objectives, all are compliant to the statute for your non-structural reserves and also your structural reserves.
So our recommendation, give you a call.
Give us a call, or if you've got a study and you
Yeah.
say, man, that's a lot of money that they're telling us to put into our reserves, talk through what funding methodology are you using? What is the funding objective of this plan? And, is this the bare minimum? Can we take, a different type of an approach? Any firm that's familiar with reserve funding would be able to have those conversations. And it's vitally important, because what we're seeing is firms that aren't necessarily as confident or expert at reserve funding are building in higher contingencies. If they're going to miss, they would rather miss putting more money into the reserves than needed. And so that's causing associations to have higher contributions and overfund their reserves, which over time is really adding up. So just make sure that, you've got the right approach going, because you're committed to the recommended funding. So don't take it, oh, this is what they say, so okay, I guess that's what we have to put into reserve. Like, use your brain a little bit and pick that apart. How did you come up with that? I mean, there's different approaches. It's not a one size fits all thing. And happy to have those conversations and any way that we can help. That I think's been one of the biggest challenges out there that I've seen is it's like insult to injury, right? We haven't funded our reserves. We wave. I'm an old association and now I have no money in reserves. And now you're not giving me like a cash flow plan, a nice baseline or threshold funding recommendation, but you're telling me I need to be 100% funded in 5 years or in 10 years, and my contributions are astronomical. If I could get into the graphs and the charts, I could really show it, but just that's my takeaway is threshold funding, cash flow funding is where you want to be, and the statute allows it.
That's excellent. So I know we're running up against the clock here. I got one question for Nicole that kind of came across. And it's, what is allowable from, and I know there's a broad question, but there's, a lot of investments, you have a lot of money, people keep their money in their banks and everything else. What, what is allowable? And it's obviously protecting the principal, I guess you could say. And then what is kind of recommended from your standpoint as you're looking through some of these budgets, and then we'll kind of end on that one. There's a lot of questions. I'm going to apologize in advance. But we'll get to those questions and we'll answer those. We have your emails and we'll start, answering those on the tail end as well.
I think the most important thing is, yes, the interest rates are great. Associations are making phenomenal amounts of interest. They're paying tax on it, but is that you as a board is protecting your asset. And also one crucial thing that I've told every association is that some of your documents do have investments in there that prevent you from doing things. So you want to make sure you're talking to your attorneys before you jump into an investment that maybe your documents prohibit. But I always recommend things that are bank safe, that are not having risk associated with it, like not going out on the stock market. Had associations call us, or I had one call me and say, can we do Bitcoin? No, you should be doing things that are safe in the banking industry, that you're making good interest, that you're not risking your principal. Like you said, Brian, do not ever risk that principal. That's not your money.
Yeah, exactly.
As Castle's Craig Vaughn put it, I really liked what he said. It's not the return on your investment, it's the return of your investment when it comes to the reserves.
Correct.
Like that.
It's a great
Definitely.
point.
Definitely. Yeah. It's all about protecting and it's just to allow it to kind of grow and be able to, and actually be able to use it. Because some
Right.
investment platforms, you could be locked in. So, we always recommend, a CD ladder. It's easy. It's kind of sold on the secondary market. So you're able to use those funds when something happens. Because again, you're running a multi-million-dollar business and stuff happens. It doesn't happen on a $5 level. It happens at a $50,000 level. So we got to make sure that you have those funds available.
Agreed.
I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Brian, Nicole, Nick, thank you so much for all your insight information. I've also displayed on the screen Nicole and Nick's information in case you want to reach out to them. They're obviously wonderful resources, and we couldn't think of better people to partner with. So thank you for your time and for being a part of this webinar. And thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate everyone to join us.
You guys do a wonderful seminar. We appreciate being honored, asked to come.
Yeah, and thank you for all the questions. These are great. Again, I wish we could get to all of them, but some of them are specific, and we'll each kind of parse off the individual ones and answer those questions the best we can. A lot of it is site specific, which means really understanding your documents. Nicole, to your point, the documents and reaching out to your own kind of legal counsel as well for guidance there. So, but we're happy to have those conversations as well. And again, thank you all very, very much.
And again, this webinar will be posted, the recording will be posted on our website at castlegroup.com by Friday. So if you want to share it with your boards or just for information, you can refer back to it. Please visit us at castlegroup.com. Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.